It's been quite a trip traveling around the country and meeting people and hearing about how different regions think about this issue. And indeed, there are major shifts that we see as we go. But it's a difficult topic, and I see a lot of people here. And I guess what I'd like to do really quickly is there any burning questions that you guys are here to have answered? And I'll try to make sure we cover it in the presentation. Is there like one thing that you're here for? Yeah.
What about the fix of seeding the atmosphere in order to cool things down?
Geoengineering. Geoengineering. It's called geoengineering, yes.
Geoengineering.
Okay. I'll put that in. It wasn't in there, but I'll try to put that one in. Okay, well then, let's just get started. Whenever we walk into and guys, let me just be honest, I have a terrible head cold right now, so I cannot hear my own voice. So if my voice drops, wave your hand so I know, because I won't be able to modulate as well as I normally can, so thank you. So whenever we walk into a room to talk about climate change, we recognize that we normally don't walk in alone. I heard that. We normally don't walk in alone. We say that we walk in with three 800-pound gorillas with us. And the first 800-pound gorilla is the fact that we all know that the climate has always been changing due to natural causes. We've had crocodiles in the Arctic. We've had ice ages. But this time, scientists say it's different. That after a period of 10,000 years of remarkable stability, man, through our own actions, are triggering a period of instability. And we're doing it at a time when there are 7 billion of us on the planet today, close to 10 projected by mid-century. And we can't just pick up our lean-tos and follow the food and water resources as they react to a changing climate. The second 800-pound gorilla in the room with us is that fossil fuels have been incredible friends to us. Before we discovered them, our lives were short and brutal. But, scientists say, if we continue to use them the way we have in the past, they will begin to hurt our GDP and lower our quality of life, especially for our kids and our grandkids. And the third 800-pound gorilla in the room with us is that this is a tough, tough topic to talk about. Perhaps it is banned from your Thanksgiving table. It was from mine for many years. I'm hearing feedback, Chris.
Yeah.
Can you, is that better? Okay. So it has been banned from my Thanksgiving table as well. But it hasn't always been thus. If you think about it, George W. Bush proposed a cap-and-trade solution in his first year of office. There were multiple bipartisan bills introduced to Congress every single year. In 2007, Newt Gingrich, the conservative congressman from Georgia, did a commercial with Nancy Pelosi endorsing a cap-and-trade approach. And in 2008, it was on the party platforms of both presidential candidates. Different ways of addressing it, but agreeing that we needed to address it. So what happened? Okay, I'm going to stand right here. So what happened? Well, scientists tell us that when Al Gore won a Nobel Peace Prize for his movie about climate change, An Inconvenient Truth, it was a watershed moment. Something that had had bipartisan but begrudging acceptance that it was a problem suddenly became seen as a liberal issue. And we had a new litmus test for what makes a good liberal or a good conservative. And the news media really didn't help. There were those on the far left who said that in order to address climate change, we had to be anti-car, anti-cow, and anti-capitalist, a hard sell. And on the right, there was a real push to begin to cover this more as a culture war issue instead of a scientific issue. Research shows that Fox News in 2006 had 50% of their coverage saying that climate change was real. By 2009, 90% said it was a hoax. So we had a real hardening across party lines. But if you fast forward to today, the vast majority of Americans understand that climate change is happening, and a strong majority understand that it is being influenced by man. But what most Americans say, or many Americans across the country and across the spectrum say, is they don't understand how climate change will impact them personally, nor why there is urgency to address it. And that is what this presentation is designed to help with. Now, we are not scientists, but we have worked very closely with scientists and energy policy experts to develop this presentation. And we've had it vetted by climate scientists at Yale, at Tufts, at Rutgers, at Princeton, and at Duke, and also by Climate Central. So one of the groups that we follow very, very closely is the group out of Yale, Climate Change Communication Program. And about 4 or 5 years ago, they came out with a presentation that said Americans across the spectrum had 5 major questions. And we decided to use those questions to organize our presentation. And when I say we, there's only 2 of us here. I'm here with my colleague, Kathy Herring, right here. And there's 12 others of us back in Princeton doing all of this work as volunteers. And I think it's really intriguing to know that our group spans from Republicans to Democrats, from conservatives to liberals, and we've all come together in common purpose to spread, hopefully, some civil discourse and understanding around this topic. So what are the 5 questions that most Americans have? Well, the first one is, how do we know it's really happening? The second is, how do we know it's us? The third is, what do scientists think? The fourth is it dangerous? And the fifth is there hope? So let's jump right in. How do we know that climate change is really happening? Well, for one thing, we understand the basic physics of how greenhouse gases work, and it's been well documented in the lab for over 150 years. Let's refresh ourselves. When the solar radiance comes in, it passes through the atmosphere and strikes the Earth's surface. And when it does so, much of that energy is absorbed, but a lot of it ricochets back out towards space. And when it does so, it's at a different wavelength. And that new wavelength is partially captured by a minute, tiny portion of our atmosphere that is made up of greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases are literally gases that are made up of 3 parts, like water, like methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. And it's literally their structure that enables them to capture that ricocheting energy and then re-radiate it back down to the surface. Without them, we would have a frozen planet. But when we add to them, it simply means that they capture more of that ricocheting energy and re-radiate it back down, warming us up and adding energy into our climate systems. Now, another way to think of this is the carbon cycle. I think we all know there's a balance between plants and animals and how we use carbon. But what we may not know is there's also a balance in where nature stores carbon. In the atmosphere, in the earth, or on the surface, and in the oceans. And I'd like to call your attention to these 2 words, fossil fuels, because I think if we consider what they are, it will help us understand what's going on. So fossil fuels are little bits of plant and animal matter that fell to the ground over millions of years ago, got silted over, and with time, heat, and pressure, got turned back into pools of carbon. And man came along and said, wow, really portable, really rich in energy, I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it in my transportation, to warm my homes, to run my factories, to drive my economy, and life was good. But in doing so, we were unwittingly taking carbon that nature had pulled down out of the system over millions and millions of years and started pumping it up into the atmosphere at the alarmingly fast rate of 40 billion tons of carbon every single year. Much faster than it happens naturally when nature is left to her own devices. And at the same time as we're taking all that carbon out of the ground and throwing it up into the atmosphere, we're cutting down our trees, we're marginalizing our wetlands and our meadows, and precluding nature from being able to reabsorb it, and in fact, adding more carbon into the air. And how are we putting up those emissions? Using those fossil fuels, primarily in our transportation and electricity sector, a little less in industry, commercial, residential, and agriculture. Though I should note that if we look at this from a global perspective, agriculture makes up about 24% of emissions. So how do we know, though, that it's really happening? Well, for one thing, scientists are measuring it every single day at over 10,000 sites, from the top of the atmosphere down into the ocean and all around the planet. And then on top of that, they add in or overlay satellite data. Now you can imagine that much raw data is kind of tough to analyze and create that big picture from, but of course we have very smart scientists to do just that. And we have 5 associations that are tasked with that specific responsibility. The Met Hadley Center over in England, NASA and NOAA here in our country, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and the Japanese Meteorological Agency. And again, taking all that independent data and independently analyzing it, they all come up with the exact same big picture. And that is that we have increased the temperature of the Earth, or the temperature has risen from pre-industrial time to today by about 1 degrees Celsius. Now 1 degree Celsius doesn't sound like a big deal, right? Because that just translates to, anybody know? 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Sounds pretty good on a cold winter's night, or even tonight, if you ask me. But in fact, small changes in our average global temperature make for big changes on how we experience life on the surface. So it's really important that we don't let those small numbers fool us. So scientists are measuring it, but they're also observing it, and we can too. Let's take a look at climate change in action with our own eyes. What we're looking at here is the Arctic Ocean. In this graphic from NOAA, it's showing how the mature ice from 1990 up to current times is melting and leaching away. It is depicted in white, and it's being replaced by open water and immature ice, which is depicted in light blue and dark blue. And the reason why this is so important is that white, mature ice is highly reflective, which means that when that initial solar radiance comes in, more of it gets sent back out into space. It almost acts like a windshield screen, right? When we protect the inside of our cars and reflect the sunlight back. And we're losing our collective windshield screen, which means we're baking in increased temperatures for future generations. It also has ramifications for geopolitical issues because as the Arctic melts, it opens it up for commercial interests, and also Russia has an open border. We also now have an entire new ocean to patrol for our Navy, which has budgetary ramifications. But ice isn't just on the water, it's also on land. Take a look at these 2 pictures of the Muir Glacier in Alaska, taken at the exact same place and the exact same time of year, 60 years apart. It looks like an entirely different planet, right? And this is happening around the world. In our own National Glacier Park, when it was founded in 1910, there were over 150 large glaciers. Today there are a handful, and they're all expected to melt away in the next 2 decades. So we're going to have to come up with a new name for our National Glacier Park. So scientists are measuring it, they're observing it, but they have another way to explain that they know climate change is happening, and that is by looking back in history to see how today is different than yesteryear. And they do that through a discipline called paleoclimatology. Paleoclimatologists study proxies, things like ancient ice cores, ancient trees, ancient seabeds and lake beds, and ancient corals. And perhaps the most intriguing one are the ice cores, because scientists like this one can actually go into those ice cores and liberate tiny little air pockets that were captured when snow fell and froze over. And in those air pockets, they can then find out what the carbon levels were going back all the way to 800,000 years or further. And what do the paleoclimatologists tell us? They are telling us that we are in uncharted territory, that modern man has never been on the planet when carbon levels were this high. So let's take a closer look. As we go back 800,000 years, you can see that our carbon levels banded between 150 and say 300 parts per million. These were the normal natural cycles the Earth was typically going through. These were the ice age and thaw, ice age and thaw. And then you can see in 1910, we broke out of that normal cycle and crossed over 300 parts per million. Today, we are about 409 parts per million. And scientists say if we continue on our current emissions path, we will hit almost 1,000 parts per million at the end of this century. And because we know that temperature and carbon dioxide move in lockstep, and that carbon dioxide lasts, parts of the carbon dioxide last over 1,000 years, we know that the carbon dioxide and carbon we put up today will affect generations as far out as we can imagine. So let's move to our second question now. How do we know it's us? Well, scientists have another discipline to help us with that, and that is called atmospheric chemistry. Atmospheric chemists can literally measure which molecules of carbon in the air come from man's activities of burning fossil fuels, because they have a different isotope, a different atomic thumbprint, if you will. So we can literally measure it. Another way that scientists know that it's us is that if you put into the climate models everything that normally affects the climate if nature was left to her own devices, things like the Earth's orbit, its wobble, its tilt, solar radiance, and volcanic activity, you get this bright blue line, which indicates that if nature was left to her own devices, we would be in a slight cooling period right now. But when you add in man's activity on top of the natural activity, you get the bright green line. And look how closely that approximates the orange line, which is what has actually been observed and happened. So again, scientists cannot explain what we're seeing in the natural world around us without factoring in our influence. And it also kind of answers that question of, well, how much of the warming is due to man? Because clearly, this indicates that all of it is. Right? Okay. Think you're with me? Let's move to the third question. What do scientists think? Because this is a really important question. It's called a gateway question. Only 20% of Americans understand how strong the scientific consensus is. In fact, this consensus is as strong as our understanding that smoking cigarettes leads to a higher incidence of lung cancer, something I think all of us in this room would take as fact. But I know there are a lot of numbers bandied around out there, so we took a look at a group that we find very credible, NASA. And on their website, they have 97% or more of climate scientists say climate change is happening and it's influenced by man. You don't get that kind of consensus in science. But perhaps you're someone who says, hey, I don't believe in individual scientists. So let's take a look at some of the most prestigious scientific associations. Would you agree with me that the National Academies of Science are some of the most credible and prestigious groups? Yes? Okay. So 14 years ago, when George Bush was president, all of the leading National Academies of Science from the leading countries of the world came together to issue a warning. And they wrote, the scientific understanding of climate change is now sufficiently clear to justify nations taking prompt action. That was 14 years ago. Chris, this is so feedbacky. Where should I stand? Where do I need to be?
That's fine.
Just stay here?
Yeah, we stay in there.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, because I don't want to annoy everybody. So what is so important about that is because some of my friends say, hey, scientists are being pressured to say climate change is happening in order to get their grants. I'm like, not so much. This is when George W. Bush was president 14 years ago. There was no pressure on the scientists at all. And yet all of them came together to issue a warning. And if you don't believe the National Academies of Science, I ask you to take a look at any association you find credible. I did for all of these, and it was unanimous. Climate change is happening, it's man-influenced, and it poses risks ahead. And if you don't believe the scientific associations, look at what the fossil fuel companies are saying. Exxon, the risk of climate change is clear and the risk warrants action. Shell, we recognize the significance of climate change. A key role for Shell is to find ways to provide much more energy with less carbon dioxide. And the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is comprised of the top CEOs of all the leading oil companies in the world, say they understand the need to meet the Paris Agreement goals and that there's urgency to address this. So if the CEO of Saudi Aramco, Exxon, BP, Chevron, and Shell all admit that climate change is happening and it's a problem, what are the rest of us arguing about? Right? So I'd like to ask you to take a minute to think about how you normally evaluate a risk in your life. If you're like most Americans, or most humans, I would say, we break that decision into three parts. The first is, how likely is that risk to happen? Well, we just saw the Arctic melting away with our own eyes. We just saw that NASA says that 97% or more of all the scientists say it's happening. And we saw that the oil companies say it's happening. So I think we can check that box, right? The second part of that risk assessment normally is, so what are the consequences? Can we live with them if they come to pass, or are they so bad that we really want to avoid them? And then the third part of that risk assessment normally is, so how difficult or expensive is it to avoid that risk? Would you agree? So let's move to that second part of the risk assessment. Are the consequences things that we are willing to bear if they come to pass? And to do that, we need to move to our fourth question, which is it dangerous? So I'd like to take a minute to orient you to this slide, because to me this is the most important slide in the presentation. Time from today going back 20,000 years. Over there on the y-axis we have temperature, and I put it into Fahrenheit so it would be quick and easy for us to read. So about 9 degrees colder to about 10 or 11 degrees hotter. The yellow is average global temperature, and the white are kind of milestones thrown on top. So you can see that 20,000 years ago, we were in the middle of the last ice age. There was a mile of ice on top of Manhattan. The southernmost glacier ended just north of my town of Princeton in New Jersey. So much of the planet was uninhabitable. And then, over about 8,000 years, nature moderated. And the temperature came up to what more or less has been the average temperature for us for the last 10,000 years, which is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And when we hit 60 degrees Fahrenheit, we were able to settle down and start cultivating fields and creating agriculture. This area is when Mesopotamia flourished. This little hill, perhaps a degree warmer, was a medieval warm period where the Vikings actually grew vegetables in Greenland. This divot, perhaps a degree and a half, was the Ice Age, when there was such deprivation on the planet. There were food shortages and great upheaval. Again, a small temperature change making for a big effect on how people experienced life during that period. And then you can see the temperature going up, up and away, and expected to land somewhere between 3.6 and 10.8 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century. So let's think about that. I know we have some gardeners in the room here. 8,000 years for nature to moderate, to literally move trees from Mexico to Montana, to march them up, to create the ecosystems and the biodiversity that we have depended on for 10,000 years. And now we are potentially triggering nature to go that same delta in 100 years. That's scary, right? And that is what brought all the countries of the world, 196 countries together, to say, We can't go there. We need to stay at the 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which correlates to a 2 degrees Celsius, or even better, a 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, because at those levels, we think we can handle the changes. We can mitigate, we can adapt, and we think we can be okay. But above that, we're not so sure. So let's drill down and look at what those ecosystems and natural services are that are being impacted by climate change. But as we do so, I'd like you to look through 3 specific lenses. First, how will these changes affect the economy and jobs in your area? Second, how will they impact your health and your personal security? And third, how will they impact geopolitical stability, which we experience as refugee crisis, civil chaos, and terrorism. Now, does anyone want to guess why I'm asking you to look at these changes through those 3 specific lenses? Anybody awake up there? What?
The largest universal impact.
Largest universal impact. Good answer. So yes, and they're also the 3 things that Americans report are most important to them when they vote. And we believe that all 3 of them will profoundly and negatively be impacted by climate change. So let's see if you agree. We're going to start off looking at temperature and how it has changed from industrial time to today. This is a graphic from NASA that shows average temperature. When it is blue, it is colder than average, white is average, yellow is warmer, and red is hotter. So, as you can see, the red really comes crescendoing in at the end, and that's because we aren't just breaking records, we're really shattering them. In fact, the 5 hottest years on record have been the last 5 years, and this year is looking like it will meet them. So that's what's happened historically. What is happening on the ground today? Well, for our friends down in Australia, they just had to add the color purple to their national heat map, because they are routinely forecasting temperatures of 125 degrees Fahrenheit. And what does it mean for you here? Well, there's a group called Climate Central that we work very closely with in Princeton, and they took a look at 26 different climate models. So this is not the worst case scenario, and projected what your summers could feel like if we continue on our current emissions path. And you can see that they anticipate that the temperature would rise by about 9 degrees and feel like a summer in southern Florida. So another thing they look at is something called danger days, and those are days when the heat and humidity would equal above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a really important time because that's when our bodies can no longer sweat to kind of cool themselves down. So it's when we get those excessive heat warnings and it's dangerous to be outside. We don't have a lot of them up in this part of the country yet, but you can see that the projections again from Climate Central is that by 2030 you might have 5 days, but by 2050 you would have 12 days when it might be too dangerous to be outside. And it looks much more frightening as you go to some of our southern cities. This is a list of cities that are projected to have almost 6 months of danger days by mid-century. And you can see there are cities that are growing now, our favorite cities, Miami, Naples, Austin, Texas, Orlando, Florida, places where the population is booming and their economy is growing. So let's take a minute to think about those 3 lenses. What do you think is going to happen to their economy and jobs when almost 6 months out of the year it's going to be dangerous to be outside? Well, we know that productivity goes down as heat goes up. We know that crop yields go down as heat goes up. We know that they'll have to build much more infrastructure to keep their people safe, and we know that infrastructure degrades in high heat, so a clear hit to jobs and the economy. What about health and personal security? Well, crime goes up as heat goes up. I think we all know that heat also exacerbates lung and heart disease. But what many of us may not know is heat is the #1 weather killer. So clear hits. to health and security. But what about that third one? What about exposure to geopolitical instability? What do scientists mean about that? Well, what they mean is that as hot as it will be in the southern parts of our country, they anticipate it will be hotter in Central America and places south. And that people there will no longer find that land as habitable, and that we can expect refugee crises like we have never envisioned coming up against our southern borders. So all three lenses clearly affected just by heat. But of course the heat isn't just in our country alone, it is worldwide. Let's take a look at this graphic from NASA, again projecting out, if we continue on our current emissions basis, what summertime temperatures could be like in some of the hottest areas of the world. And you can see in Northern Africa and the Middle East, they project that temperatures will average above 113 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the cool of the night in with the heat of the day, which means that it never cools off, which is so deadly for so many species. So let's think about that. The Syrian refugee crisis was caused by 5 million people being displaced. What sort of refugee crisis will Europe be facing if these large swaths of highly populated areas become untenable to live in? So let's move off of heat. Let's move quickly to food. This is from the World Resource Institute. It shows crop yield projected with increased heat, where it's red. It shows diminished yield, where it's green, which is primarily Canada and Russia. You can see that there are some gains. But those are not where the heavily populated areas of the world are. And if you go to 4 degrees or 5 degrees Celsius, there's really no green left on the map. And food isn't just on land, it's also in our oceans. And many of us don't realize that when carbon dioxide mixes with ocean water, it turns into carbonic acid. And it literally is changing the pH of our oceans and making it much more acidic. Today it's about 30% more acidic than it was before the Industrial Revolution. And that's really bad for creatures that make their shells of calcium. Things like clams and oysters and mussels that we all love to eat. But also for these little critters, which are called sea butterflies, that are at the base of the marine food chain for salmon and mackerel and fish that we depend on. In a survey off of California 3 years ago in the summer, 54% of the specimens they pulled up showed damage due to the acidification of the ocean today. And when you put these little creatures in water as acidic as is projected by century's end, they entirely melt away. So clearly we are putting pressures on our marine food chain and perhaps precluding future generations to be able to feed themselves from the sea. And as we are acidifying the ocean, we are also heating it up. The oceans are absorbing the greatest portion of this excess heat. As you can see from this graphic, there's some areas that are already 4 degrees warmer. And this has clear implications for our hurricanes. It's changing the amount of water they can hold, it's changing their patterns, and they're coming in different areas, their pace of strengthening or changing. And scientists are still trying to figure out what those changes mean, but they can tell that it is being impacted. And it makes sense because hurricanes are nature's way of pulling down our oceans, right? But it also has implications for our coral reefs because the heat causes this bleaching to happen. And coral reefs are the nurseries for about 25% of all marine sea life. So again, by heating up the ocean and acidifying the ocean, we're really, really hampering future generations' ability to survive from protein from the sea. Let's stay in water and move to heavy rain floods. Anyone want to guess where this heavy storm causes flood? I guess. Texas. That's a good one, right? That's just been in the news, and it's been in the news many times. Could be Texas. Could be West Virginia. Could be Charleston. Could be Louisiana. Could be Colorado. It could be almost everywhere because it's happening almost everywhere. And the reason it's happening so much is simply physics. Warmer air holds more water vapor. For every degree Celsius it goes up, it holds 7% more water. So there's literally more water to come down on our heads. If you want to see the area that has the most increased downpours, you can see that your region wins the prize. So while we may be having too much rain, in many areas we're having too little snow. Precipitation is falling as rain longer into the year, and the snowpack is melting earlier in the year. And this has real ramifications for farms and cities that are dependent on that water during the hot months of the summer. Another area that I'm sure is very close to your hearts is sea level rise. Sea level rise is one of the most bedeviling impacts of climate change, because we know we've set a lot of it into motion, but what we don't know is how fast it's going to come. How do we know that we've set it into motion? Well, we saw those glaciers melting, right? So we know that land ice is coming down to the sea. We also saw that the oceans are heating, which means they are thermally expanding. So between those two things, the oceans have risen about 8 inches since the Industrial Revolution. The best case scenario that I'm hearing is that the oceans will rise to about 1.5 feet to 3 feet by the end of the century. The worst case scenario, if we are truly unlucky and Antarctica and Greenland melt in different ways than had been anticipated, could be somewhere between 8 and 12. So drastic differences in that estimate. And clearly that will have economic harm. We took a look at Zillow, not a green resource at all, but a real estate resource, to see what they projected as loss in home cost or property loss going forward at a 6-foot sea level rise, which is kind of the mid-range. And you can see that they project that we would have about $900 billion worth of damage. And where are you guys? Very bottom, yeah. So of course Florida has the most, and you guys are less exposed. Actually, New Jersey has the second most exposure, which was a surprise to me. But let's drill down and see what that really means. What kind of losses would we be seeing in a city like Boston? Well, in Boston, they anticipate at a 6-foot sea level rise, they lose about 18% of their housing market. And in Florida, down in Miami, you could see almost 31% loss at a 6-foot rise. But of course, guys, it's not just housing, right? It's our infrastructure, it's our bridges, it's our roads, it's our railroads, it's our airports, and it's also all of our cyber optics. So so much is at risk with climate change. It's kind of hard to put a number on. But perhaps you're someone who says, hey, I don't believe in those projections. Well, take a look at what we can see up and down our coastline right now with our own eyes. And that is sunny day flooding on a bright sunny day just due to sea level rise. And this may not look so drastic, but if you're a business trying to stay open, it's really hard for your customers to get there. If you're a homeowner, it's hard to get property insurance. You have to move your car for every flood. The school buses won't come in to get your children, and it's really hard to sell your house. So real financial, fiscal stresses from climate change that we can see right now. Let's talk quickly about health. This is from the Center of Disease Control. They have a very robust site, and you have a lot of things that you would, of course, associate with climate change. But there are a couple that surprised me, including the one that I have in red, asthma. And asthma is a big hit to our public health budgets. And unfortunately, one of its triggers is pollen. And pollen levels are going up as carbon dioxide levels go up. And you can see they're anticipated to almost double by 2085. And for the gardeners in the room, I really apologize, because one of the things that grow most rampantly with more carbon dioxide are woody vines, including poison ivy. You can see, if you think that poison ivy is more toxic today than when you were growing up, it is. And it is anticipated to become more toxic and much more aggressively growing by the middle of the next century. And of course, we'd be remiss not to mention the wildfire seasons. Scientists say that forest management is indeed important, but the fact that summer-like conditions stretch so much longer in the year, it means that when a spark hits, there's a much greater possibility that it spreads so quickly and it's more dangerous and expensive. And this is another direct hit to our health, because fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes are expanding their geographical footprint and are active longer in the year. You can see right here in Providence, you guys have 23 more mosquito days today than you did in the 1980s. And the other thing that the Center for Disease Control talks about is the fact that climate change will cause mass population movement and international conflict. So what do you think the CDC means about that? Well, what they mean is when you put these pressures on places with poor governance and weak institutions, it can lead to chaos. But it's not just the CDC who says so. It's also our US Department of Defense, who wrote in a report in 2016, climate change is an urgent and growing threat to our national security, contributing to increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources such as food and water. These impacts are already occurring, and the scope, scale, and intensity of these impacts are projected to increase over time. And it's not just the Department of Defense, it's also the Director of National Intelligence, actually the former Director of National Intelligence, the Republican Senator from Indiana, Dan Coates, who wrote that the impacts of the long-term trends towards a warming climate, more air pollution, biodiversity loss, and water scarcity are likely to fuel economic and social discontent and possibly upheaval through 2018. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the loss of biodiversity. Do we have any birders in the room? Yes. So you guys must be aware of the new Audubon Society campaign that says that up to 50 or almost 50% of birds in North America are threatened by climate change. 50%, right? And it's not just our animals, it's also our plants. I'm sure you have a very special place. This is a reservoir near me in Princeton, and I like to walk my dog there. If I ever get grandkids, I plan to bring them there. There's a farm stand nearby where you can buy a crisp apple in the fall. But scientists say that when my grandkids grow up, these types of trees may no longer be in Princeton because they need the cold to flourish and they're moving north. And this is happening all around the world where we're losing our iconic and sacred spaces. And I don't know how to put a price tag on that, but to me it's kind of priceless. And what is getting a price tag on is some of the economic loss that is projected ahead. This is from the BlackRock Institute, and you can see all the areas that are not green are expected to have hits to their GDP by 2060. So let's take a minute to think about what I just shared with you. I shared with you some things that we could see with our own eyes, some forecasts from groups like NASA and NOAA that we normally look to keep us safe and find pretty credible. Do I think those projections are 100% accurate and spot on? Of course not. They're just projections, and so much of it is based on what we choose to do. But are they credible? Because anywhere else in our lives, when the consequences are this extreme and the risk was deemed credible, we would take immediate action to avoid those risks. How many of you guys have fire insurance? Just about all of us, right? And we probably close our fire doors and buy smart appliances and do things to make sure that our home doesn't burn down. Scientists say that the potential for climate change to negatively impact each of us in this room is much greater than the chance of our houses burning down. But we aren't according it the same respect we do other risks in our lives. Now, I know there are pundits that say, hey, don't buy into that, don't get alarmed. The models are so over-reporting the risk, right? We all read those. But what you don't read in some of those conservative places is the other side of the equation. The scientists who say, actually, the models underrepresent the risk because they don't capture the black swan events, things that are less likely to occur but are truly catastrophic. Like what? Like the melting of the Arctic permafrost. We all know that when things die up in the Arctic, they often freeze before they fully decay. But the Arctic is warming faster than any other part of the planet. And now they are decaying en masse, putting up methane and carbon dioxide. And scientists fear it could create a natural feedback loop that man could never control. So we have the scientists saying, hey, don't worry, be happy. We have the scientists saying, hey, drink heavily, the Titanic could go down. And we have the vast majority of the scientists in the middle saying, hey, this is a real risk. But there are smart things that we can do to lower that risk. And we're asked to take a bet, right? And we're making that bet not just for ourselves, but really for everyone on the planet. And not just for everyone on the planet right now, but for our kids and our grandkids and future generations. And the question is, how do we make that bet? What would a prudent person do? I can tell I've really depressed you. So I am going to move right on to question number 5. Is there hope? Because sea change conversations resoundingly believes there is hope. And the reason we believe there's hope is because the economic equation around this issue has been turned on its head. We all know that old economic equation, climate change is something that if it happens, it's going to happen to far-off generations, and it's much better that we strengthen the economy now, don't do anything to hamper it, and let them handle it then, right? Didn't we all hear that? I heard it tons. The new equation is, woo, as taxpayers, we are paying for climate change right now out of our own pockets. And the cost to move to a low-carbon economy has dropped so precipitously and so fast, it is crazy not to do so. So what do I mean about paying for climate change out of our own pockets? Well, we are paying to repair from what hit us and to prepare what we know for what we know is coming. So take a look at this chart. This comes directly from ecoRI, who, by the way, began to talk about climate change and warn about climate change in the 1970s. This shows losses. And we can see how they've increased from 1980 to 2016. Now, ecoRI and scientists don't say that every increase in every bar on this chart is due to climate change. Of course not. We've always had disasters. But what they do say is that climate change is having a real and significant impact. That it is, in fact, loading the dice or stacking the deck, making these disasters more likely to happen and often making them more expensive and more deadly. And at the same time as we were paying to repair, because in 2017 we spent over $300 billion on repairing from natural disasters, which was 3 times what we paid for public education in this country. We are also preparing for what's hitting us, a $14.5 billion wall to protect the southern flanks of Louisiana, right? The Corps of Engineers says $2.8 billion to protect Norfolk. New York City is looking at 60, I'm blanking on the number, 35, 60 billion number for their seawall. Don't quote